Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled through the frozen peaks, cutting across, Fiona says, face like a blade. Her cloak flapped wildly as she stood at the edge of the cliff, gazing out over the vast expanse of snow and ice. The icy landscape stretched endlessly before her, illuminated by the pale light of a distant sun. Somewhere out there beneath the glaciers and frozen rivers lay the sword of winter, the key to an eternal winter that could plunge the entire continent into a frozen wasteland. Fiona gripped the hilt of her sword tightly, feeling the weight of her mission settle on her shoulder. The Queen's last words echoed in her mind. You must stop Loki at all costs. The sword of winter cannot fall into his hand. Loki the sorcerer, whose ambition knew no bounds, had already conquered half the continent through dark magic and deceit. If he succeeded in obtaining the sword, he would have the power to freeze the entire land, bending all to his will. Fiona couldn't let that happen. She turned her back on the frozen horizon and made her way down the rocky path. At the base of the cliff, her companions waited. They were an odd group, each with their own strengths and motives, united only by their shared mission. Fiona approached them, her breath visible in the cold air. Are we ready? She asked, her voice firm despite the cold gnawing at her bone. Taryn, the elven archer, glanced up from adjusting her bowstring. Her sharp emerald eyes scanned the surroundings, ever watchful for danger. As ready as we'll ever be, she replied, her tone clipped, though there was a glint of determination in her gaze. Beside her, Brom, the stout dwarf engineer, was tinkering with a mechanical device, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble for such detailed work. He grunted in agreement, stuffing the device into one of his many pouches. The sooner we get moving, the better. These mountains give me the creep. Roland stood a little apart from the group, his dark cloak billowing in the wind. The reformed sorcerer, once an ally of Loki, now sought redemption through this mission. His pale face remained impassive, but Fiona knew he felt the weight of the others' distrust. His knowledge of dark magic made him an invaluable asset, but his past ties to their enemy couldn't be forgotten. We were all wasting time, Fiona said, her voice cutting through the cold air. Loki's forces are already on the move. If we don't reach the Glacier of Ages before him, it'll be too late. Without waiting for a response, she turned and began leading the group further into the mountains, the crunch of snow beneath their boots, the only sound amidst the howling wind. The days blurred into one another as they trekked through the frozen wilderness, their journey marked by relentless cold and treacherous terrain. They encountered small groups of Loki scouts, ice golems and frost beasts, sent to slow them down. Each time they fought fiercely, but the toll of constant battle weighed heavily on them. One night, as they huddled around a small fire, the mood in the camp was grim. Brom was nursing a wound on his arm from a recent skirmish, while Taryn kept watch, her bow resting on her lap. Roland sat silently, staring into the flames, his face unreadable. We were close to the Glacier of Ages, now, Fiona said, breaking the silence. We need to be prepared for anything. Loki's sea forces will only grow stronger the closer we get. Taryn glanced at Roland, her voice cold. And how do we know we were not walking into a trap? He's been awfully quiet, don't you think? Ryland didn't flinch at her accusation. He kept his gaze on the fire, his voice low. I have no reason to betray you. If I wanted to, I could followed you astray long ago. Convenient, Tarny muttered, her hand gripping the hilt of her dagger. Enough, Fiona snapped, her patience wearing thin. We can afford to turn on each other. Now Loki is the enemy, not Roland. Roland looked up, meeting Fiona's gaze. I know the traps that guard the Sword of Winter. I can help you navigate them when the time comes, but you will need to trust me. Fiona held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For now, we rest. We'll need all our strength for what's to come. The next morning, the group stood before the Glacier of Ages, an enormous wall of ice that towered over them like a fortress. Fiona's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight. The glacier seemed to pulse with an ancient, malevolent energy as if it were alive. This is it, Brom muttered, staring up at the glacier, the sword somewhere inside. Then let's not waste time, Fiona said, her voice steely. We go in, find the sword, and stop Loki, simple. But as they approached the glacier's entrance, a shadow moved in the distance. A group of mercenaries, hired by Loki, emerged from the snow, their leader, a tall, brutish man, grinning wickedly. as he drew his sword. Well, he sneered. Looks like we've outfound ourselves some competition. Fiona drew her sword, the cold metal gleaming in the pale light. If you know what's out good for you, you will walk away. The mercenary leader chuckled darkly. Sorry, love. I forgot my orders, and you read my way. Without another word, he lunged forward, and the battle erupted. Fiona met him head on, their blades clashing with a sharp ring that echoed across the glacier. Tarn loosed arrows with deadly precision, while Brom hurled explosives that sent mercenaries flying through the air. Roland, standing back, summoned dark tendrils of magic that snaked through the battlefield, ensnaring enemies and freezing them in place. But the mercenaries were well trained, and the fight was brutal. Fiona parried a strike from the leader, gritting her teeth as their blades locked. You win this, she growled. The mercenary smirked. We don't just have to. We just need to slow you down. With a burst of strength, he pushed Fiona back, sending her skidding across the ice. She regained her footing just in time to see one of the mercenaries make a run for the glacier center. Stop him, Fiona shouted. But it was too late. The mercenary disappeared into the glacier, and Fiona knew they had little time left. With a final furious strike, she disarmed the leader and knocked him to the ground, pressing her sword to his throat. Where's Loki? She demanded. The leader grinned, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Closer than you think. Fiona scowled and knocked him out with the hilt of her sword. She turned to her companions, her heart pounding. We need to move now. Inside the glacier, the air was colder than anything Fiona had ever felt. The walls of ice seemed to hum with power, and the ground beneath their feet was slick and treacherous. They moved cautiously, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. This place is a maze, Brom muttered, glancing around warily. One wrong turn, and we could be trapped in here forever. Roland stepped forward, his hand raised as he murmured an incantation. A faint glow appeared in the air, illuminating a hidden path through the ice. Follow me, he said quietly. I know the way. They pressed on deeper into the glacier until they reached a vast chamber filled with towering pillars of ice. In the center of the chamber, the sword of winter lay embedded in a block of ice, its hilt gleaming with an ethereal light. Fiona's breath caught in her throat. They had found it. But before she could take another step, Roland held up a hand. Wait, the trap. He moved carefully around the chamber, muttering incantations and dispelling the ancient magic that guarded the sword. But as he worked, Fiona noticed something in his eyes, an uncertainty, a hesitation. Roland, she said quietly, what is it? He didn't answer at first, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I designed these traps for Loki long ago. I never thought I'd be the one to undo them. Fiona frowned. You regret it. I regret many things, he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt, but this is my chance to set things right. With a final incantation, the last of the traps was disarmed, and the path to the sword lay open. But as Fiona stepped forward to claim it, the ground trembled beneath her feet. A crack echoed through the chamber, and the ice walls began to close in around them. Run, Fiona shouted, her heart racing as they bolted for the exit. The walls of ice groaned and shuddered as they raced through the glacier's narrowing corridor. Fiona led the way, her sword drawn, the cold air cutting through her lungs like shards of glass. Behind her, Brom's heavy footsteps pounded in time with her own, while Tarini's lithe form darted through the icy paths, scanning for dangers with her ever-watchful eye. Roland moved swiftly, his face tense as he muttered incantations to keep the collapsing glacier from crushing them. They burst out of the narrowing corridor into an open cavern, gasping for breath, the tremors subsiding for the moment. Fiona glanced back, watching the tunnel they had just come from close behind them with an earth-shaking crack. We won. Be so lucky next time. Brom growled, leaning heavily on his axe, his breath visible in the freezing air. Fiona nodded, eyes scanning the area. The path ahead split in several directions, each as foreboding as the last. The cavern-esque jagged icicles gleamed ominously in the dim light, and the echoes of distant movement sent a shiver down her spine. What now? Tarn asked, her hand never leaving the bow at her side. We have the sword's location, but it won. Mattered if we were buried alive. Roland stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. We were close to the heart of the glacier. There's another way through. We have to keep moving. His voice faltered. From the shadows ahead, a familiar figure emerged, his presence sending a wave of cold through the cavern that made the very air crackle with frost. Loki. His tall, imposing figure was wrapped in dark robes, his pale eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. In his hand, he held a staff, its tip glowing with a menacing blue flame. Behind him, a battalion of ice golems lumbered forward, their hulking forms shimmering with frost, their glowing eyes fixed on Fiona and her companion. Loki said, his voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the cavern. I see you've made it farther than I expected. Impressive, really, but you were too late. Fiona stepped forward, her hand gripping her sword tightly. We were not here to impress you, Loki. We were here to stop you. Loki's lips curled into a cruel smile. Stop me, my dear Fiona. You have no idea what you were up against. The sword of winter is within my grasp, and with it I will reshape this world in my image. He raised his staff, and the ground beneath their feet trembled once again. Ice surged up from the floor, forming jagged spikes that blocked every path of escape. The ice golems moved closer, their heavy footfalls shaking the cavern. Fiona's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her sword steady, refusing to give in to fear. We want to let you have that power. Loki's smile widened, and with a flick of his wrist, the golems charged. Fiona barely had time to react before the nearest golem swung its massive arm toward her. She dodged to the side, feeling the icy wind rush past her as the golem's fist smashed into the ground where she had been standing. With a swift motion, she slashed at its arm, her blade biting into the ice, but doing little more than chipping it. Focus on the joints, Brahm shouted as he hurled one of his explosives toward another golem. The explosion sent shards of ice flying, but the golem barely slowed its advance. We need to take them apart piece by piece. Taryn was already moving, her arrows flying with deadly precision. Each one struck a golem's knee or elbow, causing the hulking creatures to stumble and falter. But for every golem that fell, two more seemed to take its place. Roland stood at the center of the group, his hands raised as he summoned dark tendrils of magic. The black energy snaked through the air, wrapping around one of the golems and pulling it down, its frozen form shattering as it hit the ground. But even as he fought, Roland's face remained grim. We can too win this fight, he said through gritted teeth. Not here, we need to get to the sword before Loki does. Fiona knew he was right. As powerful as they were outmatched by Loki's sea forces. Their only hope was to reach the sword of winter and destroy it before Loki could claim its power. Then we pushed through, Fiona shouted, her voice filled with determination. She charged toward Loki, her sword raised high. The sorcerer sneered, raising his staff to block her attack. Their weapons clashed with a deafening ring, and for a moment, the two were locked in a deadly standoff. Fiona could feel the cold emanating from Loki's staff, chilling her to the bone, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward with all her strength. You think you can stop me, little warrior? Loki hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. You are nothing compared to the power I will wield. Fiona glared at him, her muscles straining as she pressed against his staff. Power like that destroys everything it touches. With a burst of strength, she broke free from the deadlock, slashing at Loki with a fierce, wide arc. He dodged the tip of her blade, grazing his robes, but the momentary distraction was enough. Roland, his eyes glowing with dark energy, unleashed a powerful blast of magic that sent Loki stumbling back. Go now, Roland shouted. I'll hold him off. Fiona hesitated for only a split second before nodding. She turned to Taryn and Brahm. Come on, we were getting that sword. The three of them sprinted toward the far side of the cavern, where the sword of winter lay, still embedded in its block of enchanted ice. The air around it was unnaturally cold, even for the glacier, and Fiona could feel the raw, terrifying power emanating from the weapon. But as she approached the sword, the ground shook violently beneath her feet. She turned just in time to see Loki, having recovered from Roland's attack, raising his staff once more. With a guttural roar, he unleashed a wave of ice and frost that surged across the cavern, heading straight for Fiona and her companion. Tari moved with lightning speed, her arrows flying in quick succession, but they barely slowed the oncoming wave. Brahm hurled his last explosive, the blast creating a temporary barrier of fire that held back the frost for a few precious seconds. Fiona knew they had no time left. She lunged toward the sword of winter, her hand outstretched. As her fingers closed around the hilt, a shockwave of cold energy surged through her body, freezing her in place for a split second. Her vision blurred, and she felt the crushing weight of the sword, its power pressing down on her mind. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. With this power, She could end the war, freeze Loki and his armies where they stood, and protect the world from his tyranny. But at what cost? The sword would not be wielded lightly. It would demand everything from its bearer and more. No, she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. I want tight. Let this power consume me. With a mighty roar, Fiona raised the sword above her head and brought it crashing down on the block of ice. The enchanted ice shattered, sending shards flying in every direction. But instead of claiming the sword, said power, Fiona did the unthinkable. She lifted the sword high and drove it into the glacier's heart. The ground trembled violently, and a deafening crack echoed through the cavern as the glacier itself began to fracture. Loki's eyes widened in horror as the walls of ice that had once protected the sword crumbled around him. The power he had sought for so long was slipping away. No, Loki screamed, his voice filled with fury. You cannot do this. But it was already too late. The sword of winter, now embedded in the glacier's core, unleashed its final surge of power. The glacier began to collapse in on itself, the ancient magic that had held it together for millennia now unraveling. Fiona stumbled back, her breath ragged, as the entire cavern shook with the force of the glacier's destruction. She could see Loki struggling to maintain control, his magic faltering as the ice beneath his feet gave way. With one last desperate glance, he vanished into the swirling frost, consumed by the very force he had sought to control. Fiona fell to her knees, exhausted but victorious. Taran and Brahm rushed to her side, pulling her to her feet as the glacier continued to crumble around them. We need to get out of here, Brahm said, his voice urgent. Fiona nodded, her legs trembling as she stood together. They ran for the exit, the ground collapsing behind them as the glacier's heart gave way. As they burst out into the open air, the glacier of ages collapsed behind them with a deafening roar. The power of the sword of winter sealed away forever. They stood in the snow, breathing heavily, the weight of their victory settling over them. Fiona looked up at the sky, watching as the dark clouds that had loomed over the glacier for so long began to part, letting in the first rays of sunlight they had seen in days. It's all over, Taran said quietly, her voice filled with awe. Fiona nodded, her heart swelling with relief. The sword was destroyed, and Loki was gone. The world was safe for now. As they turned to make their way back to the kingdom, Fiona knew that this was not the end of her journey. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face, but for now they had won, and that was enough.